Welcome to Documents in Detail, a webinar and podcast series that explores the core documents of American history. Today we are joined by our host, John Moser of Ashland University, and panelists Stephen F. Knott of the United States Naval War College and Dan Monroe of Millikan University. This is the final episode devoted to an in-depth look at the history of American foreign policy prior to 1899. Did the imperialistic impulses of the late 19th century destroy America's small r republican identity, or was it merely a continuation of the manifest destiny ideology that had guided American expansionism since the founding? Join us as we discuss Carl Schurz's resonant 1899 speech against American imperialism.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I'm professor of history and chair of the Master of Arts program in American History and Government at Ashland University. And I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series, in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically important documents. We encourage all of you joining us this evening to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box and not the chat box so that I don't have to monitor both of them. We will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you will receive an email with links for further reading on tonight's topic, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from our program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from the various volumes in our core documents series. They are also available at the Teaching American History website's extensive, indeed voluminous document database located at tah.org. The subject of our program tonight comes from the volume on American Foreign Policy. I have it right here, American Foreign Policy to 1899, that is, edited by Steve Knott. The document is Against American Imperialism by Carl Schurz, and to help discuss it are Steve Knott himself, recently retired as professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the United States Naval War College, as well as Dan Monroe. He is Associate Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Millikan University. Both gentlemen are also faculty members in Ashland University's master's program in American History and Government, as am I, as a matter of fact. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
So first of all, I find this is a fascinating document. I really am interested in this period of history. This is a great debate. Occasionally we have in U.S. history these great debates about the whole course of American foreign policy. What do we stand for as a nation? And of course we have one of those at the time. Could you tell us a little bit about our protagonist here, Carl Schurz?
Sure, John. So Carl Schurz was an immigrant from Prussia. He had really a fascinating life. He was involved with a revolution in Prussia in the late 1840s. I believe it was directed at toppling King Wilhelm Frederick IV or something along those lines. And he paid a pretty serious price for his revolutionary activity. He did some time in prison, very uncomfortable prison, needless to say, escaped and eventually made his way to the United States, where he settled in Wisconsin, where there is and was a substantial German immigrant population. With the approach of the Civil War in the mid-1850s, of course, Wisconsin is somewhat ground zero for this new up-and-coming Republican Party, and Schurz is very much an active participant in the early stages of the rise of the party, and comes to know an former Illinois congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln, and enlists his efforts on behalf of the Lincoln campaign in 1860. After President Lincoln wins the election, he appoints Schurz as his ambassador to Spain. He's not there all that long, I think not even quite 2 years, returns home and takes a commission as a Union officer. I believe he's a major general in the Union forces during the Civil War. Not entirely sure how much action he sees, but he's certainly, an important part of both the rise of the Republican Party and the Union war effort. After the success of the Union effort, Schurz ends up in Missouri, where he becomes a United States Senator from Missouri during the Grant administration. And this is where he's going to sort of break with the Republican mainstream. He is not a friend, or he's not an ally of Ulysses S. Grant. They tend to break over 2 issues. One is Grant wants to acquire Santo Domingo for the United States, and Senator Schurz leads the charge against that acquisition, against that imperialist act, if you will. And Schurz is also an opponent of Grant's somewhat forceful enforcement of civil rights laws for the newly freed slaves in the South. He's later becomes Secretary of the Interior under President Rutherford B. Hayes, where he is responsible for policy towards Native Americans. He has depending on which historian you want to believe, he has something of a mixed record at best on that question. He keeps the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the Interior Department and keeps it out of the hands of the War Department, which probably would have made the status or the living conditions of Native Americans even worse. So on the one hand, he seems to have a desire to keep it from being viewed as the Native population being viewed as enemies. But on the other hand, he's also responsible for some forced relocations. To bring him up to date with the period here that we're looking at with this document, he leaves the Senate. He's defeated after 1 term. He becomes a prominent journalist, including for a journal called The Nation. And he leads the charge against American imperialism in the 1880s and in the 1890s. For instance, he's a strong voice in opposition to the American acquisition of the Hawaiian Islands during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison. And then bringing us up to date with this particular speech from 1899, he is a strong opponent of the Spanish-American War and the sort of consensus. Well, I don't know if consensus, that's a little off, but the pressure within the Republican Party to acquire territories in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, etc. Schurz is dead set against that as a betrayal of American principles.
I'm going to ask Dan to chime in a moment, but was he an opponent of the war itself, or only of the attempt to profit from it in terms of territories?
Maybe you guys could correct me, but I thought he was an opponent of the war itself.
Yes. I simply don't know. I know that there were many, as William Jennings Bryan, who were a lot. There were a lot of, probably the Democrats were more hawkish than the Republicans in 1898. But okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
Dan, what would you add to that?
Schurz supported Bryan, I think, over the.
He did.
Yeah,
he did.
so I think that I think Schurz opposed the war too. I think that was a great summary. I don't know that I could add to it other than to note that Schurz had a remarkable life. I mean, good Lord, as Steve pointed out, he started out being thrown in prison for opposing the German monarchy, and ends up in the United States in the Union Army, and as a leading figure in the Republican Party because he represented this kind of German vote that was strongly anti-slavery, that was an important part of the Lincoln's coalition. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but there were German language newspapers in the Midwest who were very strongly supportive of the anti-slavery element, or very strong anti-slavery element of the Republican Party. And Schurz was important to propitiate that, which is why he got his commission. I mean, Schurz was, not, probably someone who should have been a general officer, but, he
Yeah.
became a general officer because Lincoln, as you know, Lincoln had to give out some of these commissions to keep his coalition together.
Yeah.
Maybe did I understand you correctly, Steve? You said that he was an opponent. Schurz was an opponent of Grant on Grant's Reconstruction policy.
Yeah. So that's it. Well, it's an interesting point, John. So, I think Dan is not right to point out that initially Schurz seems to be, on the forefront of the early Republican Party in the notion of certainly halting the expansion of slavery. I'm not sure, but I would classify as time goes on, and I don't have a good handle on this, I have to confess. During the Grant administration, he does become an opponent of what he sees as a heavy-handed federal enforcement of various civil rights measures, not only the amendments, but the Civil Rights Act of 1870, I believe, and the creation of a Department of Justice, one of whose main responsibility is to enforce the equal protection of the laws for the newly freed slaves. He is not at all comfortable with this. Again, I wish I had a better handle on what it is that leads him to at least some alterations of his position. The 1840s and 50s Schurz seems to be a little bit different than the 1870s Schurz when it comes to the rights of African Americans.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would just add that this was not unusual. I mean, there were a number of Republicans who had been strongly anti-slavery, but were not comfortable with the federal government and essentially governing the South to support blacks' political and civil rights. And the sad reality is, why did the civil rights effort in the 19th century fizzle out? Because Northern whites weren't comfortable with it. I mean, really, the Army had to stay. And I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but the truth is, the Army had to stay in the South for 50 years. In order for the civil rights to kind of for Black Americans to be saved, and people in the North weren't prepared, at least not a majority, were prepared for that commitment. And Schurz was one of many who made that migration to that view.
Yeah.
Right. We probably shouldn't spend a whole lot of time on that. It's not our major area of interest. I recently
we'll be back next week to talk about Reconstruction. So tune in. Tune in.
Richard White's book, The Republic for Which It Stands, part of the Oxford history. He talks about this phenomenon to a certain extent, and he and other liberal Republicans become highly anti-majoritarian and very elitist. So White even suggests that they start to sympathize with what had been the old slaveholding class, because they were educated and regarded as natural leaders. But let's talk about the setting for this speech. America in the 1890s. Obviously, there's just been a war. What kind of background can you give us for this speech?
Well, I think one of the important things to mention is that the United States becomes the world's largest economy, according to most economic historians, sometime around 1892, 93, 94, somewhere in there. We exceed the GNP of Great Britain at that point. We are the world's economic power. And there's a kind of complementary thinking that goes along with that. And Schurz touches on this in the speech we read for tonight, where if we're going to maintain our position as the world's #1 economic power, we have to make sure that we have markets abroad that are open to us. Therefore, that requires military expenditures, requires a navy, and perhaps even the acquisition of foreign territories. I think that's one important place to start. The other factor, of course, is that I've always seen the late 19th century American imperialism as a continuation of the fulfillment of the doctrine of manifest destiny. That now that we've reached the Pacific Ocean, why stop there? There's really nobody in our way to prevent us from acquiring places like Hawaii or American Samoa or the Philippines. And there is a strategic argument to be made for acquiring places like that. So I would say that's sort of the larger, and large numbers of Republicans of Schurz's party and some Democrats, as you mentioned, John, have bought into this notion that manifest destiny is, in a sense, is alive and well. And you throw into that mix a growing progressive belief that we have a duty, a kind of almost Christian obligation to uplift some of these more downtrodden folks around the globe, excuse me, who don't share our standard of living and our system of government with its rule of law.
Ben?
Yeah, that's right. Very good. And I would just say two things. One is when I started to lecture about this period and did some research, I was so struck by the intense focus in American newspapers on British colonial adventures. You know, for example, Gordon managing to get himself killed in Khartoum, and Richard Burton's, Arabian Nights, things like that. There's an almost breathless quality to the coverage of that in the 1880s, 1890s. And I think Steve's right. There's a certain continuity here about this American sense of manifest destiny. And also, going along with that, there's a culture that, instead of being repelled by British colonialism, looks upon it as, gee, this is exciting and new, and we should, because now we're this economic colossus, and we fought this great civil war to end slavery, we should join in this too, because we can bring that kind of moral, redemption to the world. And of course, this can be problematic, as we all know. And the other thing I would say is, and I'll shut up, is it's interesting how Schurz ticks off in his speech. He addresses each of these pro-imperialist arguments. The religious argument, the kind of Teddy Roosevelt argument. I mean, each one of them, Schurz makes a point of saying, well, here's why this is wrong. It's a very good speech. I mean, so you see these kind of cultural and intellectual points, him kind of ticking them off as he goes along.
John, if I could just add to something Dan said, he mentioned this fascination in the American press with Britain and with the British Empire. Today happens to be the anniversary of the American toppling of the Hawaiian monarchy during the Benjamin Harrison administration. But in the build-up to that American intervention, on behalf of people like Sanford Dole and others of the Dole pineapple fame, were endless newspaper reports about the possibility of the Brits and maybe even the Russians acquiring that beautiful base at a place called Pearl Harbor. And so in the early 1890s, many Americans are looking westward and thinking of the threat presented to us by the old world powers in the Pacific arena. And Hawaii becomes, in some ways, the first test case of how serious we are about countering that threat, which, by the way, seems to have been mostly a media creation.
Yeah, when I was in graduate school, Dan, of course, will remember my advisor, Paul Schrader. I learned a term in one of his classes a German term called Torschlusspanik. The fear that the door was closing and we have to get ours before the world gets divided up. That was very strong in Germany at this time, but you pretty clearly see it in the United States as well. If we're going to jump in on this, we have to do it now, or everyone or the other powers are going to grab all the good stuff.
Right.
One other thing I wanted to throw in too, as long as we're talking culture, is the Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. And I do think there's an element of, well, we've conquered North America, now let's go abroad. And Theodore Roosevelt is a big exponent of this, of course. I mean, there's that magnificent speech that Roosevelt gives in Chicago in 1898 titled "The Strenuous Life." What could be more revealing? In other words, we have to strive. We've got to live this life to the fullest, and we need to take our place on the international stage. It was very heady stuff. It was in Chicago to one of the main businessmen's club in the period. And I've often, I do a fair amount on Hemingway. I've often thought that Hemingway was strongly influenced by that whole, this is what he lived and breathed in Oak Park, as a boy and then as a young man, and he spent most of his life abroad. But it's so that all of that is kind of filtering through the culture. That's that kind of pro-imperialism cultural mindset.
There's kind of a crisis of masculinity going on at this time. It's like our parents' generation fought in the Civil War. What are we doing? The middle class is we're not taming the frontier anymore. We're working in offices. Maybe we're, as the term Teddy Roosevelt, like mollycoddles that don't know what it's like really to go out there and be tough. So that there's this need to assert our manhood by going out there and acting like other manly men in taming or bringing the benighted peoples to Christ and showing them civilization.
Absolutely true, John. Absolutely true. And of course, in concert with that, they never would have used this term at the time, but all the folks we've already mentioned are believers in American exceptionalism. And we did have this sort of divinely inspired role to bring the gospel of self-government, of Republican government and capitalism to the rest of the globe.
Yeah, but in a sense, though, you see the argument among the imperialists. Of course, we're talking an awful lot about the imperialists when our real subject is sure. But in a way, you see among the imperialists almost a repudiation in some ways of it, because really, I mean, if you want to find it, if you want to really find the exceptionalism, it's in the anti-imperialists who said we don't do this because that's not who we are. Meanwhile, you've got Albert Beveridge saying we should join the ranks of the progressive nations and take our place among them in carrying out this mission.
That's an excellent point, John. That you see this in Schurz's remarks here. I mean, he's the one who cites the farewell address. He's the one who mentions the founders. He's the one who mentions the Declaration constantly. I think he would have said, no, we are the defenders of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism says you set an example for the rest of the world for sure, but you don't set it to the point of a bayonet. And you don't betray your own founding principles in order to spread them abroad. That we are the true believers in true Americanism.
Yeah, I would just add to that. There's and you've both alluded to it. There's a strong religious element here. It's a very intense missionary spirit at this time, particularly in China. Hemingway's one of his relatives, I was going to say his grandparents, it wasn't his grandparents, but his uncle or someone was a missionary in China. That was not unusual. So part of the imperial impetus, but there's an element of Christianity and the anti-imperialist, argument as well was, we need to go forth and help civilize and Christianize the world. And so both sides tried to claim that moniker, but it's we give for Josiah Strong and others. I mean, it's floating around all through these arguments. And I found the only other thing I would say is I think your allusion to Theodore Roosevelt and masculinity is amusing because it's so true. I mean, Roosevelt directly says we don't want to become a nation of obese shopkeepers. We have to, get into the war. We need to, there's nothing like a war to get you fit. Yeah. And so let's do it. And it just has to be said, he not only, he walks the walk, he talks the talk, but then walks the walk, I mean, literally, leads his regiment up a hill. So in the Spanish-American War under fire.
And of course, Teddy Roosevelt is always embarrassed by the fact that his father bought a substitute during the Civil War. And he sure as hell wasn't going to follow that model. So yeah, John's masculinity thesis is one that I think deserves further exploration.
Well,
it's not original to me.
I know. Yeah.
It just has to be said too that Hemingway, of course, Hemingway masculinity is a big theme in Hemingway studies. Hemingway would say, tell his sons, being a man is a hard thing. It's hard to be a man. In other words, he was constantly emphasizing that there was a certain obligations that came with manhood and masculinity. Well, to me, I've written this. It all comes back to Theodore Roosevelt in this whole period, and the debate over what kind of a role the United States should play in the world.
Yeah. We've got a few questions from viewers, listeners. Richard Rago asks, why Santo Domingo? Did it have a strategic or economic value for the United States?
Yeah, President Grant certainly thought that it did. This was one of the ugliest battles, probably in terms of foreign policy, the most divisive battle of Grant's 2 terms in office. But he did firmly believe that it had a strategic value for the United States, certainly in the Caribbean, but even beyond in the Atlantic. We were again emerging as a world power. Our economy, even during the Grant years, was chugging ahead at full speed. And a beautiful port such as Santo Domingo would be a plus for the United States in terms of protecting our trade routes in the Atlantic and in the Caribbean. And back to what we said before, there was always this perception, if we don't do it, the Brits will. And we have to beat the British to the punch. Now, again, for people like Schurz and opponents in the Democratic Party as well, one reason you don't want to take a place like Santo Domingo, and we haven't touched on this yet really, is because of racial differences. If you take a place like that, you're going to be presiding over a people who aren't up, and this is them, not me, aren't up to the standards of Anglo-Saxon culture. And that's going to just drain the United States. It's going to require an occupying force because these people can't govern themselves. And ultimately, and Schurz gets into this even later in the speech we read for tonight, it's going to alter the character of the American people as well, in terms of having to act as occupiers, but perhaps even somehow importing certain non-Anglo-Saxon cultural elements that are going to sap our precious bodily fluids, as Buck Turgidson might say. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
But that was Jack D. Ripper, though.
Jack D. Ripper. Sorry, thank you, John. Of course, you would know that. Yeah.
Dan, you care to add to that?
I'm sorry, I lost you.
You care to add to?
Yeah, we're in a period of social Darwinism, and it's permeates everything, and so it just has to be said that the race problem in the South has been resolved in a way that is essentially white supremacist. And so you have that floating around as well. And so all that coalesces into this argument that, or contributes to the argument that Steve just outlined about, the undesirability of certain races.
Yeah. So this is one thing. This is one thing that both sides of this debate have in common.
Yes.
The question. So you've got social Darwinism, the Anglo-Saxon race, and I suppose Schurz might add the Teutonic. Add the Teutonic race to that too.
Right.
They are clearly superior. The question is, what does that imply for American foreign policy? The imperialist side says that means we have a responsibility to go out there and govern others and maybe raise them up. The other says, well, we don't want to be contaminated by that kind of thing.
John, notice the similarities here for those in the audience who were with us when we talked about Henry Clay's market speech. Clay had the same concerns about the impact on the American political culture of occupying a territory of people who were not like us, who are of a different religion, different skin color, entirely different culture, that was somehow going to warp American mores. And it would also require an enormous occupation force that would drain our treasury, and the soldiers who would have to do the occupation duty would be contaminated in a sense. Both Henry Clay and Carl Schurz are on the same page, even though we're talking 50 or so years apart.
Yeah, that's an important point that Steve has just made. I mean, and I think it's quite interesting that both Schurz and Clay talk about the danger to American republicanism. But, you know, if you become an imperial power, you're going to subvert the republic. We're not going to be what we were intended to be. I mean, they're speaking in the language of classical republicanism with a small r. You know, classical republicanism warned that, you know, if you engage in military adventurism, you get a military despotism, you know, like the Romans. So you don't, you know, you always want to have a small military established. You don't go out searching for beasts to slay. You're the anti-colonial power. So, you know, it's very interesting how that argument comes all the way forward. And here you have Schurz saying this at the end of the 19th century. It was very commonly bandied about in the antebellum period and before.
Yeah. And by the way, notice that Schurz, he raises the specter of a sort of an American Napoleon Bonaparte
Yeah.
coming to the fore, you know, having to preside over this enormous empire with an iron fist. Look, you know, some of Schurz's arguments are going to be echoed throughout the 20th century. In some cases on the American right, during the Vietnam era on the American left. And to this day, you hear it, I think, both from folks on the left and also from libertarians about the distorting effect of American empire on the American political culture. And this line from Schurz could have easily been uttered by, you know, George McGovern in 1972. Let me just quickly read it. Schurz observed that the United States, quote, cannot long play the king over subject populations without creating within itself ways of thinking and habits of actions most dangerous to its own vitality. Anyway, just
the imperial presidency.
Yeah, exactly.
We got some great questions here. Shayla Nelson asks, during this time period, about what percentage of Americans would have opposed American imperialism? Is that something we can answer?
I mean, public opinion polling, I don't even think it was occurring then. If it was, it would have been totally inaccurate. It was completely inaccurate in the 1930s, never mind the 1890s. I mean, in 1932, they predicted Landon over FDR in a landslide. I wish I could, I mean, maybe Dan has some sense. Look, there was serious congressional opposition to Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt's imperialism. Serious opposition, substantial numbers. I can't, however, get any more specific than that. And when it comes to American public opinion, I'm even less certain.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would just add that I think it's analogous to the Mexican War in that the Mexican War had strong popular support, but there was also strong dissent, and significant dissent. But there's no way to measure it because there's no Gallup data until what, 1939, 1936, something like that, whenever Gallup. But to me, it's almost direct. I mean, there's a real strong popular current at the end of the 1890s in favor of or that feels that this is you know, oh, this is wonderful. We're asserting ourselves on the national stage or the international stage, and that's rightly so.
Yeah, I would go ahead.
Sorry, John. One place to look would be the votes in Congress after McKinley's war message. And I know there was substantial opposition, but that would at least give you some sense of the congressional opposition. And of course, these people are hearing it from their constituents. I just don't have that vote in front of me at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of members of Congress would have cited the amount of mail, the percentage of mail they got on one side versus another.
Yeah, exactly. Good.
And remember too that part of the imperialist argument was that we're doing this for these people's own good. You know, we're saving the Cubans from a rapacious Spanish regime, and the same thing with the Filipinos. So there's an element of, I mean, there are people who would support this who would otherwise might not be inclined to embrace imperialism because it seems like an altruistic thing. You know, I always think of President McKinley saying, well, I got down on my knees and prayed about what to do about this, and I decided we need to do this because we need to help these people. You know, and I think there's a real missionary element here that made imperialism palatable to lots of people.
And then, of course, when the USS Maine is you know, the whole explosion in Havana Harbor, that gives McKinley some defensive cover in a sense. Now we all know it's not at all clear what caused the explosion in the Maine, but American presidents historically will always look for an incident, whether it's the Gulf of Tonkin, whether it's James K. Polk, you know, and the abuse, the attack on Taylor's army, or the attack on the Maine, to say, look, we've been attacked. As a commander-in-chief, I'm asking you and Congress to give me the authorities to take the force of the United States against the enemy. That's a consistent thread throughout American foreign policy, this notion of defensive wars.
And I suppose the result of the 1900 election, in which Bryan was soundly defeated by McKinley.
There you go.
Yeah. Good point, John.
Yeah, that's a great, it is a great point, because there you have I mean, if there was a huge opposition to the war, that would be one way to express it, by voting in Bryan.
Yeah.
Richard Rago asks, is our quest for imperialism following? So to what extent is Mahan's influence of sea power upon history part of the argument here? The need to acquire sea lane and coal refueling stations.
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent observation. I should have brought it up. I just retired from the Naval War College, where Alfred Thayer Mahan was the dean at one point, or the president, excuse me. He's something of a god down there still. Absolutely true. And of course, Mahan had a considerable influence on a number of progressives, including Beveridge, including Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt actually visited the Naval War College at the time when Mahan was there. So yes, Mahan is a key strategic thinker for American imperialism. There may have been instances where some of these American political figures distorted Mahan's arguments for their own political agenda, but nonetheless, that's the school of thought that he's associated with, and I would say for the most part, accurately so.
Dan?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You know, I think the American military, naval, diplomatic elite were very, very interested in acquiring coaling stations for the Navy, and so they bought into Mahan's argument. And you know, Mahan was right. I mean, in the sense that well, if your cruiser is out in the Pacific and runs out of coal, it's just going to be floating up up and down. You know, so it's a real problem that had to be addressed. Go ahead.
Quick point. One of the somewhat small bureaucratic entities that benefits from the Spanish-American War and benefits from this era of American imperialism is the Office of Naval Intelligence. It was the first bureaucratic entity ever created by the United States government with a specific focus on intelligence. And it was created in the 1880s, but it's during the late 1890s and in the early 20th century that ONI just sort of takes off, and it becomes sort of the eyes and ears for the United States government around the world, both during the Spanish-American War and then even more so during the First World War, where there are ONI operatives all over the globe feeding information back to Washington, D.C.
That's awesome. Yeah.
My friend Jake Peterson. Hi, Jake. He asks if Grant was against the Mexican War, but in favor of purchasing the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo, so that plus 80, would he have been, do you think, had he survived into the 1890s, he would have been a supporter of imperialism?
Oof.
Remember, you can't be wrong.
Good point.
That's right.
Well, Santo Domingo was going to be acquired without any. I mean, it seemed as if there would be no armed resistance. To the extent that that was a factor in Grant's desire to acquire it, I think it was a factor. Dan probably knows a hell of a lot more about Grant than I do. I would assume some of his opposition to the war with Mexico was that he understood that this was a war that would benefit the slaveholding powers in the South who desired to expand slavery even further. But that's about as far as I can take that question.
Yeah, I would just add that I don't know that Grant would have supported. I guess what I would say is Grant probably would have asked, if Grant was still around in the 1890s, Grant would have asked hard questions. Would be the best way of putting it. I don't know that he would have been, I think, given what we know about Grant's attitude towards the Mexican War, he would have been someone who would not have been, simply leapt into the imperialist argument or advanced the imperialist argument. I think it would have said, well, is this really morally right?
It is interesting to know one of the leading opponents and one of Schurz's main allies during this Spanish-American War era was Mark Twain, who of course was quite close to President Grant and funds the whole memoir writing, Grant's memoirs, and getting them published. That just came to mind that Twain was one of the founders, along with Schurz, of this. What was it, the Anti-Imperialist League?
Mm-hmm.
So a great question. Sorry, I couldn't be more specific. Dan was a little more helpful than I was on that.
Well, you make a good point about Twain. Twain and Grant were very close,
Yeah.
and as you point out, Twain helps get Grant's memoirs out. So it's reasonable to make that point and suggest that maybe that Grant would have shared Twain's anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
Cooper asks, what did different cohorts of contemporary Americans feel about early U.S. imperialist adventures in the Pacific and Caribbean in the early 1900s?
The early 1900s.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, certainly, look, one of the key, and Schurz is already on to this, that the Philippines is going to be the Achilles heel of American imperialism. And he was absolutely dead on about that. This country, our country, is going to engage in one of the bloodiest, ugliest, protracted guerrilla wars in its history that doesn't get the attention to this day that it deserves. But we're going to be fighting in the Philippines well into the First World War. In fact, I believe General Pershing is there in the Philippines prior to being sent overseas to Europe. And that guerrilla war, that counterinsurgency effort in the Philippines is a disaster. And it leads to horrific, what today we would call war crimes on the part of various American units operating in the Philippines. And this is precisely what Schurz is warning about, that it's going to change the character of those soldiers who have to fight this imperialist war. And somehow that is going to seep back into the American bloodstream. And I think he was absolutely dead on. So the questioner perhaps is onto this, the Philippines becoming a symbol of the real ugly side of American imperialism in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would just add that the tremendous Filipino casualties, by all estimates,
Yeah.
into the six figures, rather startling in total. And I think I read once where the waterboarding was actually pioneered in the Philippine campaign. But
I've seen that as well.
yeah, and I wondered if the question is the questioner is alluding to is like filibustering expeditions in the antebellum period, which were not popular in the United States, and were more of an expression of this Southern desire to acquire additional territory for the purpose of expanding slavery. But the filibustering expeditions did not get good press, were not, except maybe some extreme newspapers like Charleston Mercury in the South. So if he's alluding to that, contemporaries were not. Those are very generally very unpopular.
Yeah. Yeah.
And typically went awry with everyone imprisoned or killed.
Right. Yeah, wasn't
They
there
were
one band in Nicaragua led by this guy Walker, I think.
yeah, William Walker. Yeah.
Yeah. It would make for a good Mel Brooks movie.
It was a big fiasco. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alan. Since Dustin Baker asks, since Schurz was a part of the Lincoln administration at about the time of the eventual acquisition of Alaska, would he have viewed this as an act of imperialism or something that defined American foreign policy goals in a different way compared to the 1890s? That's a neat question.
Another terrific question. I believe he's elected to the Senate in 1867 or so, 67, 68. And Seward's Folly was right around that time. A terrific question. I just don't know what his position was on the Alaska acquisition. He may, to speculate, have been less troubled by it in that it was almost contiguous with the continental United States. He does reference the fact that we lack that geographic physical link to Puerto Rico, to the Philippines, to Cuba, etc. We almost have it with Alaska. And it's, for the most part, or at least from the American perspective, uninhabited and
Right.
probably not going to require a massive military presence. That may have put him somewhat at ease.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Schurz, I don't know what Schurz's position was on Alaska, but for the reasons that Steve outlined, I think he would regard it as much more benign.
Yeah, what he says on 163, compare now with our old acquisitions as to all these important points, those at present in view. They are not continental, not contiguous to our present domain. They are all situated in the tropics, which Alaska is absolutely not.
That's right.
Although just because it wasn't in the tropics doesn't mean that it was inhabited by Anglo-Saxons. They're more or less densely populated, and their populations consist almost exclusively of races to whom the tropical climate is congenial.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. No. He is absolutely convinced that a tropical climate produces a certain lassitude in the folks who live there. Now, John, you just came back from Florida. Maybe you're feeling a little lassitude at the moment.
The stories of Florida, man.
But he really did. Montesquieu in the 18th century devotes chapter after chapter in the Spirit of the Laws about the impact of climate on various political cultures. So, go ahead, John.
This makes me want to know more about the prevailing attitude toward the Inuits and the other peoples there.
That's a great question.
Tropical culture. I don't really. This is something I really don't know anything about, but would like to know more about. Adam Cooper asks, to what extent were U.S. activities in the Pacific about enhancing our military, economic, et cetera, presence in China?
Yeah. That is a factor. and Schurz mentions that. He dismisses its importance. He argues that we would still be able to trade with China, without having these military outposts thousands of miles from the United States. But that was, in terms of the imperialist argument, that was definitely a factor. The Western powers see this new enormous market, and they all want to go in and take advantage of it, and we're part of that. No question about it.
Go ahead. No,
it's amazing to me how often the China market comes up in American discourse, like from the middle of the 19th century, if not earlier, through much of the 20th century. The idea that there are 2 billion armpits in search of American deodorant, and that we have there's unlimited potential there.
It's cigarettes.
Deodorant, John.
China still, enjoys smoking. So it's when I was in China some years ago, and I found it refreshing that there was so much smoking going on. Big billboards too with advertising American cigarettes, and
American cigarette companies love China.
Yeah, no, they do, and it was one of the great ways to get to have a conversation with a Chinese national was to fish out a cigarette, and and invariably would take it. But I would just note that it's in this period that the so-called China lobby emerges, becomes a very strong factor in American foreign policy calculations. We're in this sense, you get the sense from Hay's open door notes, we're the protector of China. These European powers, they just want to economically exploit it, but we're sending missionaries.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course we want our share of the pie too, but we're doing it in an altruistic way.
Yeah.
We're running out of time, but Gloria Sesso, I think, asks a question that we might end on. Although I've got something else too to ask. Do you think did imperialism destroy American republicanism? Right? Did this mark the loss, so to speak? And these are her words, of our virginity as a nation.
Yeah. Very, very tough question. I used to have what I thought was a very certain take on this question. My argument always was that America's role in the world did not lead us to sacrifice our principles, did not lead to some grand alteration in the American character. I have to say, the older I've gotten, the less certain I am of that. But it's a terrific question. I personally would put more of the emphasis in terms of, if there has been an alteration in terms of the American political culture, that it was domestic policies. It was the impact of progressives, many of these same folks we talked about tonight, TR, for instance, altering the domestic political scene for reasons unrelated to our role in the world. That may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I think that's sort of still where I am. But I have to admit, the older I've gotten, the less certain I am that the role that we played in the 20th century, it was a net positive, and that it did not impact us at home. I'm less certain of that.
Dan.
That's a great answer. And I would just, my take on it would be that, Steve's answered the question of whether or not, or offered a question about whether the American Republic was altered. I would just throw in that the concerns of classical republicanism, or of American republicanism with a small r, persist to this day. We're still, in other words, the political debate is still very much animated, especially about internationalism, our role in the world, the size of the military, by these fundamental principles of classical republicanism. How large should the military be? How involved should we be in this crisis in Europe and in this crisis in Asia. So I do think that there's, I mean, it's a great question that Steve has addressed about how it's altered the country, but I think ideologically, we're still, I think, very much influenced by the classical Republican tradition. So that persists. I don't think that's changed.
Well, I always like to end these with a final question. We've got an audience that is made up primarily, if not entirely, of teachers. Give us your best pitch for why this document deserves a place in their American history curriculum.
I think it's a classic statement of America's ambiguity in terms of its role vis-a-vis the rest of the world. To present that even stronger, it's a classic statement in defense of what Dan had just mentioned, in a way, a persistent theme for 230 years of American history. To what extent should we be engaged with the world? Most folks think we should be engaged, but is it just trade or is it more than trade? What Schurz is saying here is that there is a cost to playing the role of what we would today say the world's policeman. And if your students are curious and if they want to know about America as a superpower and the pros and cons of America as a superpower, I think Schurz's speech is as applicable today in 2023 as it was in 1899. And for that reason, I think teachers, all of us, should pay attention to it.
Yeah, that's very good. I would just add that it's a pithy, relatively pithy excerpt, but he hits all of the major imperialist arguments, and he does it with great force, but also with brevity. So the advantage of using it in the classroom is that you can talk. You see Schurz addressing Josiah Strong. You see Schurz addressing the question of the end of the frontier. You see him addressing Theodore Roosevelt's, "Oh, we need to go out into the world." He says, for example, he says, "We're admonished. It's time for us to become a world power." And Schurz says, "We're already a world power." It's very pithy, but it has great force. So what better to use in the classroom when you have people with limited attention spans, and you want to have the most impact in the shortest possible way.
John, could I just quickly add, this debate is very much with us now, right? I would say large elements of the Trump movement share many of these beliefs of Carl Schurz. Of the United States being overextended. The United States should not be as involved as it is in the rest of the world. But it's not just the Trump movement. There are a lot of voices on the left as well who are making this argument that we are overextended. We're paying a price. The defense budget for the United States of America in the coming year, over $800 billion just for defense. And you got folks on the left saying that's insane. You've got some MAGA folks saying that's insane. Many of the arguments that you see in the Schurz speech are relevant to today's debates.
Very good. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of our panelists, Steve and Dan, for their participation tonight. I also want to thank our participants for the great questions they offered. As a reminder, you're going to be receiving an email within the next week, and that email will include a link for further readings. It will also include a link to the archived webinar. We hope that you will share that with your colleagues and get it out there on social media as well. If you've enjoyed tonight's webinar, I hope you'll consider taking one of our graduate courses in our MAG program, either online or on campus at Ashland University in the summer. You can find more information about our course offerings, as well as all sorts of other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. Our next edition of Documents in Detail will take place on Wednesday, February 15th, when we'll be talking about Abraham Lincoln's Peoria address. That comes from our latest core documents volume on Lincoln. Joining us at that time will be that volume's editor, David Tucker of the Ashbrook Center, actually two editors, David Tucker of the Ashbrook Center and Joe Fornieri of Rochester Institute of Technology. They will be joined by Jason Jividen of St. Vincent College. Thank you all for being with us here tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thanks again for listening to Teaching American History's webinar on Carl Schurz's speech against American imperialism. For more information on our webinars, core document volumes, in-person educator professional development programs, graduate program, and free document library, please visit us at tah.org.